I was born in 1931 in April, and my two brothers were, of course, 14 and 18 years older than me, so they were men, of course, when I was born. And then of course, when I was 8, the war started. So when both my brothers were taken away, the eldest one went in the RAF, and he was stationed at Mildenhall, and my younger brother, who was 20, he was eventually posted to Northern Ireland, and when he used to come back to England, to Birmingham where I was, he would say, at 7 o'clock we would say, "Oh, we've got to go down to shelter now." And he'd say, "What on earth are you going down the shelter?" "Well, we're not going to stay in there." "Well, I'm sleeping in the house," he said. And he used to go upstairs and get into bed. But my mum insisted that I went down the shelter. And he'd say, "You haven't been out in the shelter all night, have you?" I say, "Yes, I have." "Oh dear," he said. And then eventually we moved up to Tamworth, where we were bombed out in Birmingham. We moved up to Tamworth. That's where my mum was born. And we stayed up there, I think, about 3 years maybe. And we lived in a lovely house on the Ashby Road. It was a lovely house which was lent to us by one of my mum's old school friends. Back to Birmingham. Then I can't remember how we got the house in Birmingham, but we did, and we moved into that house in Shirley, which was a very nice house. And eventually both my brothers came back from the war. My eldest brother, as I said, was in India, and he came back in May, I think it was May. And my other brother, he came back from Germany, having seen the remains of Belsen. He was a medical man, so he was driving about getting the water. He was what they call a waterman, and he had to go and find a reservoir or something, and he had chemicals to test the water, and he had to get this little tanker he was being driven in to fill with water, so the soldiers could fill their water bottles with water, which of course they needed every day, of course. But then, en route to one of these places, he saw this clearance in the forest, and that was Belsen. And they'd never have seen it before. They didn't know what it was, but they didn't go in. They just left it and reported back, as it were. They didn't have radios or nothing, but they reported back. And both were demobbed on the same day, amazingly. And then my brother got a job in a big factory making pins, safety pins, straight pins, hair grips, things like that. And they used to make about 10 tonne a day. That's an awful lot of pins, but they used to export them all over the world. Nappy pins they made, and I think they were the beginners of spraying them pink and blue for boys and girls. And eventually they came back, as I've said, and then my elder brother, who was in the RAF, he went back with his wife and his little son, and my other brother came to us, and we all lived together. It was my mum and dad and the two lads, and he was the sort of chap, as I've said, he was 13 years older than me, and I literally idolised him. If he said black was white, then I would have believed him. That was it. What he said went. And we used to go to the football to see Birmingham City at Birmingham City Football Ground, and then we go into town, that's Birmingham, and have a meal or something. Then we go to a show if we could. We went out together, always went out together. And just amazing how I loved him so much. But then, unfortunately, when we eventually moved down to Southend, he couldn't get a job Well, he started in a little factory because he was an engineer, but he didn't like that. So he eventually got a job as a traffic warden. And he said, I didn't want to wear uniform again, but he liked it because he was outside and he was more or less his own boss. So he could nip into a cafe and have a cup of tea or whatever. But what I used to do, I used to go and pick him up in my car, our car. Used to go and pick him. He didn't drive. I used to go and pick him up in our car at the headquarters. But this particular day I went to pick him up, and his mates were there, and they said, "Oh, Jack hasn't come in yet. I think you better go to the hospital." I said, "Hospital? Why should I go to the hospital?" He said, "I think you ought to go to the hospital." So I went home and picked my mum up, and I drove her to the hospital, and we were shown into this room, and there he was laying prone, slightly up, not flat, and he'd got one of those little things in his mouth that maintains an airway. And the doctor came in and asked us a few questions, and I said, "And how long is he going to be like this then?" And he said, and he looked at his watch, he said, "Oh, I would say in 3 hours he'd be dead." I said, "What? You're joking?" He said, "No, he's had a brain hemorrhage, and as you can visualise, his brain is filling with blood." He says, "And, the pressure's going to be more and more and more because his heart's still going." And he says, and eventually he will die. And I was holding him on his wrist, on his left wrist here, and I was holding it, feeling his pulse, and about 10 to 7, there was no pulse, it just disappeared. And that was it. I'd lost my best friend of all, and it broke me up, that did. But of course, when we finally pulled ourselves together, and I had to take my mum out in the car, then we were driving to Southend, and the first thing you'd see was a traffic warden. And then my other brother, he was a school teacher, and he'd been during the war in India. He used to do aircraft recognition. He used to draw an aircraft by seeing one, and he'd painted blue or whatever colour it needed to be, and he used to do hundreds of these. This is before photostats came out, and he used to do hundreds of these different aircraft, so they used to send them to the squadrons so they could recognise enemy aircraft. And then when he came out of the Air Force, his famous best line was lettering, and he used to do the lettering over shops. And I saw some of his work, and that was amazing, gold leaf and all the rest of it. And it was a clever chap. I've got a painting in my bedroom that he painted when he was 12. Just amazing it is. And then he eventually decided, and my dad told him years ago, "You should be a teacher." So he decided to go to Alsager, which is in Staffordshire, to a teacher's college, and he went there and got his whatever he had to get, and then he got a job as a teacher, and he never looked back. But of course he liked to teach art more than anything, because I can remember sitting on his lap when I was a little baby, and he'd draw me a train, steam train coming towards me, and this train was seeming as though you could hear it. And then when he'd finished, he'd say, "How that?" And I'd screw the paper up and I'd say, "Do another one." And I don't know what happened to them bits of paper, because they were things that we couldn't replace, but still. And then he eventually did the schools, and he used to do, because of his lettering, used to do all the things in the hall of all the boys that had done things in the war, VCs and all that. He used to do all that in the church, in the school entrance, and any lettering wanted to be done, he would take his mob stick, which is the thing with the little thing on the end, and he'd do the letters and he loved it. and eventually he went to work in a school at near Leighton Buzzard, a place called Wing. If you look on a map, it's on the Leighton Buzzard Road, Wing. There's a big house near there called Ascot House, and he was teaching there, and he had a heart attack during the night, and that was it. He'd gone. But that upset everybody, of course, especially his wife. His wife was absolutely broken-hearted, because they were devoted to each other, and they'd planned when he retired, they'd planned all that, what they were going to do, and oh yes, but that was all thrown out the window when he died, because he was only 50 when he died. It was terrible, really. We all had a cry for that. And then when my brother, who was not married, died, I was very lost what to do and where to go. Fortunately, I could drive, so that's how I used to take my mum up to London, up to a show. I used to take her up to a show, and we saw all the shows in London, My Fair Lady and all those. So we tried to obliterate the sad parts, so she could have a laugh and all that. But we got over it, we have to get over it, don't we? And then eventually I'd moved in to Lee in the Blicker flats. In those days, 75, 78, 80-year-olds were visited every month by the doctor. That was the stipulation. And this doctor used to come and visit her. Hello, my Christian name, and he'd come in and I'd let him in. And this particular day, she keeps on saying to me, the doctor's coming today, isn't he, Graham? So I said, yes, he'll be here soon. Yes, is he coming? Yeah. She must have asked me 100 times. Are you sure the doctor's coming today? I said, 1 o'clock he's coming. Oh, right. And about 1:05, ding dong, that was the doctor. And he walked in, and he had looked through the windows because they overlooked the sea. And he said, now, Mrs. Shaw, he said, what can I do for you? And she had a heart attack and died while he was there. Just amazing. He laid her out on the settee, and he said, oh, she's gone. I said, oh, is she? That was peaceful, wasn't it? So he said, yes, it was. She wasn't in any pain at all. I said, oh, that was lovely. I said, and he's asked me, do you want anything you want? So I said, yes, I'll have a wedding ring. So he said, right. So he took a wedding ring off, and within a quarter of an hour, her body had gone. So all I had to do was organise a funeral, and everything went out. And after that, I started looking, shall we say, and I found my wife that I've got now, and I couldn't be any happier, really. Absolutely. Well, I've married into a big family, the Walker family, which I think if we were to get them all together, I reckon there's well over 100 now. And it's like a tribe, not a family. And everybody's so good in the family, and we meet. And my mum is one of 7, and 6 of us meet every Friday at one of my brother-in-law's barns. And we, as I said, meet, have a cake, a piece of cake and a cup of tea, and we're all together. And yes, it's great. It's really, really great.